Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hive Live. We are thrilled to have you back on our series dedicated to having approachable conversations about cybersecurity. So, thanks for joining us. I'm Alex Nett, your host today, and we have a very relevant and topical workshop lined up for you today. We are talking about DMARC, SPF, DKIM, and everything in between. While this is not about sunscreen or suntan lotion in any form or fashion, we're going to talk about some things that may be impacting the security and the deliverability of your company's emails. So let's start at the top here. What are you walking away with today? Well, it's going to be an understanding of what SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records are, a breakdown of how to properly configure each record, and ultimately a step by step process for creating a rollout plan. So let's start at the top with the symptom checker. Have you ever found out that your company's email was being used to send spam? Or have you ever had your legitimate emails end up in someone's spam folder or even not delivered? Or have you ever had marketing emails sent through third party companies like Constant Contact, MailChimp, Amazon SES, Salesforce, SendGrid, any of those companies? And have you ever had trouble with them being delivered as well? Well, a great way to check that, for example, is within Google. And if you use Gmail here for your company, you may have seen an email get delivered like the top box here, where there's a question mark and a stop sign next to the name. That means that there's an issue with the deliverability and the authentication of those emails. What you're able to do, especially in Gmail, is you can click on the top right corner on the three dots and open up and show original, which will give you the below box. And that's going to show you a subject line and ultimately what the SPF, DKIM, and if there's a DMARC record are showing. In this case, the SPF record was a score of neutral with DKIM at fail. And so as a result, this is saying that the email, and especially Google in this case, is not sure if the email is from the actual company or somebody else. As Google and other large email service providers ratchet up their enforcement of these protocols, everyone, including your company, is going to have to ultimately work to meet them. So let's dive into it. Up first, SPF stands for Sender Policy Framework. DKIM stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail, and DMARC stands for Domain Based Message Authentication, Reporting, and Conformance. You're not going to have to remember what any of these mean. And today, especially, we're not going to dive into the specific technologies and pieces that empower some of these frameworks, but more about how to configure your settings and get everything correctly set up. Up first, for the opener, it's SPF. So there are two types of domains that most companies have. The first, domains that send email. So this might be your core domain, like hivesystems.io for us. And you may have domains that don't send email. These might be things you bought as domains that are for future purposes or other domains that you bought to sit on them. So maybe they are domain names that are similar to your domain, like hivesystems.net or something else. And so while you don't actively use them, you wanted to own them. This will be important because as we step through each one of these parts, there are certain records that we're going to set for the domains that send email, and there's certain records that we're going to set for domains that don't. So, looking at your mise en place, which means everything in place in the world of cooking, you're going to need to identify everything that can send an email as your domain. Again, your domain is in your email address, the part that comes after the at. So, alex.netty at hivesystems.io is our domain. And so this includes anything that could send from your email servers. So if you use a web based email like Google Workspace or Microsoft 365, or if you maybe have some in house ones like Microsoft Exchange, which hopefully you've patched from the recent major vulnerability that's come out. You also want to look at any other email service providers that you use. So these could include companies that provide email marketing or bulk email services. So if you leverage anybody like Constant Contact, MailChimp, Amazon SES, Salesforce, SendGrid, HubSpot, any of those companies, you'll want to note those in this list that you're developing as well. Finally, you'll want to check some of these miscellaneous services. And this is going to be a little bit cross department in its endeavor. So you're going to have to go and talk to some of the IT teams. Maybe you have a help desk ticketing system that sends emails on behalf of somebody, or HR benefits providers posing as your company, or even e-merchant services. You'll want to go through and document each and every single one of these as part of this list. So now that you have your list, start diving into the settings of each place you have identified. Sometimes a quick Google search for SPF records will show up. The SPF record is generally the same. So the SPF record will be set the same generally for Salesforce or Constant Contact or MailChimp, and a quick Google search can usually pull up this record. Unfortunately, not every email company offers the information required to implement SPF. And so as a result, you may not be able to actually implement SPF for every domain. Generally, though, for most of these providers, if they don't offer SPF, they do offer DKIM. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Quick note here, too, you only have one SPF record ultimately that we're going to set. And so this includes the information for all of those senders that we just created on that previous slide. So, showtime. Up first, you're going to head to your DNS provider. So this is where you bought your domain name, most likely, or where your domain is hosted. You could have bought it through Google or maybe Amazon or Namecheap or somewhere else, but you'll want to go to that provider that has your domain. Once you get in there, click on your domain. You'll click edit or add record or something along those lines. And ultimately, you're entering the following. Up first for the name, you'll set it as blank or set it to an @ depending on what your service has as a default. For the type, you'll set it as a text record. And for the TTL, which stands for time to live, you can leave it at the default value or set it to 1 hour. For the data piece, this is where all of the work from earlier comes into play. This is where you'll actually create the SPF record. And so it might look something like these two examples. What do those two things mean, and what are all the parts in here? Well, up first, V equals SPF1. This indicates it's an SPF record. You'll always start with that. Then you're going to want to document any of the IP addresses that you were provided by your email senders. So in this case, it may be just a specific IP address, or it may be a range of IP addresses, which has that /24 at the end. If you have multiple IPs, you'll stick them like you see here with IP4 and then the IP address, and then you'll stick another IP4 and the IP address. If it's an IPv6, if you're familiar with that, you'll stick IP6. If you have a marketing domain and they give you a specific domain, you'll use include and then that marketing domain company name in there. You can have a maximum of 10. So this is important to note for that piece. Finally, at the end, you'll have an all. And there's two different ways. And we'll talk about this later on in the strategy piece of this. But the first is the tilde all, which is a soft fail for the SPF record. It means that if this email from your domain comes from an IP or domain not listed in your SPF record, the receiving email server will note it as possibly spam. But if you do a -all, this is a hard fail. And that means that the receiving email server, so where you are sending the email to, should reject it if the IP address of the sending email server is not listed in your SPF record. That basically stops a hacker or a scammer who wants to use your IP address, or rather your domain emails, to impersonate your company. What we recommend generally is you start with a tilde. That's a little bit softer, gives you a little bit more room in terms of what might go wrong. And later on, you'll increase it and scale that up to the -all. As you remember earlier, there are two types of domains. For those domains that don't send email, you're going to set a defensive SPF record. In that case, you're going to set it to just like this, which is V equals SPF1 -all. As you may remember from the previous slide, where we included IP addresses or domains, in this case, since there are no places that are allowed to send email, by setting as this, we're stopping somebody from misusing that email, or rather that domain. No matter how you set your SPF record and how it all ultimately gets laid out, you're going to want to validate your changes. And there are many free websites available. A great one is by DMARC, and there's a link right here for that. And you can go in, enter your domain, and check it. And it'll let you know if your record is valid, if you miscreated it, or maybe right now, if you don't have one, you can check and validate that you don't have one in place. The second act here is DKIM. There are two types of domains. Hey, does this look familiar? Domains that send email and domains that don't. So let's get set here with the Swedish chef again. Again, you'll have to identify everything that can send email as your domain. So just like we did earlier for SPF, you can leverage that same list. And if you already have everything in place, you'll be good to go from that standpoint. So we'll take our list and start looking around through all the settings of each of those companies to see if they have a DKIM option. A key piece here is that a major part of DKIM is that the private key is ultimately going to be placed on your DNS server or your email server, while the public key will go in your DNS record. And again, sorry, the private key goes in your email server. The public key will go in your DNS record. So DKIM is individually set. And so that's unlike the SPF records, where there's generally one SPF record for a whole company. Each company will ultimately get their own DKIM record. As a result, though, it's a little bit more complicated for you and your email provider, and complicated for some of these companies. So, not every company offers DKIM services. As a result, you might not be able to implement it, and that's okay. But generally, the goal here is to have either SPF or DKIM, but ideally have both of them in place for every single company that you have in use. What's great about DKIM is it actually survives if an email is forwarded. SPF records don't do that. Unfortunately, they cannot check back. They can only check at kind of that first hop, if you will. So when the email is first delivered. For DKIM, that gets attached to the email permanently. And so it gives a much better attribution that the email did actually originate from your company. Something to note too, you may have multiple DKIM records, one for each of your senders. That's different than SPF, where we stuck all of the senders into one record. So we'll have multiple DKIM records across the board here. So again, we're going to head to your DNS provider, crack that window back open and click Edit or Add Record. In this case, for the name, this is where you're going to put the selector that your email company gave you. And so generally it takes the following format with the email company name dot underscore domain key. So it might be Google dot underscore domain key, Salesforce dot underscore domain key, something along those lines. For the type, you'll leave it as text if it looks like the first example below. We'll get into that in just a second. Or CNAME if it looks like the second example. For time to live, you can leave it as a default value or set it to 1 hour. And for the data, this is where you'll put the public key that your email provider gave you. And so it'll come in one of two formats, either the first one here, where it's V equals DKIM and then a long string of characters, or it might just be a simple URL like the one below. Again, if it's the first one, your record type is going to be TXT or text. And if it's the second one, it will be a CNAME record. So if we break that down for that first record, DKIM indicates that it is a DKIM record. And so it always starts with that. The K equals RSA talks about the type of key. And in this case, it's about your public key. And then ultimately, that long string of characters after the P is the public key, and it's matched to the private key on the email server. So, as we talked about from before, there are two types of domains. For those domains that don't send email, if you've already set that defensive SPF record, you would also set a defensive DKIM record. In this case, as you can see, ultimately we set the name as something because there's no email provider, and the data with that private or public key, the P equals, gets left blank. That ultimately makes this whole thing not work and means that nobody can send email on behalf of the server. This is a great way, again, to stop those hackers and scammers from misusing your company's email. And like we said before, no matter how you set your DKIM, you need to validate those changes. Again, from DMARC, there's an inspector for your DKIM records. And so you'll go in and enter your domain, but you also enter that selector. You'll remember that selector was the first part that came before that domain key. So it might be Google or Salesforce or something else. And you'll drop that in and click Inspect DKIM, and it should spit out whatever record you had dropped in during your configuration. Let's move on to the next part. For the grand finale, it's DMARC. So there are three major benefits to DMARC. DMARC verifies that a sender's email messages are protected by both SPF and DKIM. DMARC also tells the receiving email server, the person that you are sending an email to, what to do if neither of those authentication methods passes. So before, when we set the SPF and the DKIM record, it tells the receiving email server that, hey, this isn't from who it says it's from. However, neither SPF or DKIM have to be enforced by that receiving email server. So it's just like the postal service receiving an envelope and going, yeah, we're not sure if we should deliver this or not, but there's no rules that tells us that we shouldn't. DMARC enforces that and says this is the letter of the law. And so based on what we put in this DMARC record, we'll let that receiving email server know what to do with it moving forward. Ultimately, DMARC provides a way for that receiving email server to report back to the sender, that's you, about messages that pass and or fail about the DMARC evaluation. This is the biggest benefit to the DMARC record setup. Ultimately, it lets you know who's sending emails on behalf of your company. This is great, your understanding to make sure that maybe that list you compiled earlier does align with what you know, or if there are emails being sent on behalf of your company that don't land on that list. This can let you track down from a security standpoint, shadow IT, or things that maybe aren't understood or under IT's purview in terms of management and operation. But it can also let you know if somebody's impersonating your company regularly. If you've had trouble with vendors saying they're receiving misused emails or things that seem to be from your company, but they're not, this DMARC report will start to give you all of that information clearly and easily. So, as always, with our friend, the Swedish chef, we need to collect that list of information. We have that big list that we worked for before from our SPF and DKIM records. And we need to make sure that we create a DMARC record for every single domain. So, as we talked about earlier, for SPF, there's going to be one SPF record for every domain. So, it contains all your SPF sender information in it. For your DKIM, depending on how many of those companies on your list offer DKIM, you'll have one or more of those DKIM records, and you'll have one entry for each email. And for every domain, you'll have one DMARC record, and that's going to contain your policy for what to do with the results from the 2 previous checks. As we talked about before, there are 2 types of domains that send email and domains that don't. So, since you still have your DNS provider up and ready to go, and you're all logged in on that edit screen, for the name, you're going to set it to _DMARC. And for the type, you'll set it to a text record. And the time to live, you can leave it as the default value or set it to 1 hour. For the data, this is where your DMARC record is going to go. And we recommend you use a DMARC generator to make this process easier, but we're going to step through all of the parts here to explain how to set it up properly. Once completed, your record is going to look something like this. So let's break it down. Up front is V = DMARC1. This indicates that it's a DMARC record. The first part here where it says P = reject or P = quarantine, this is where we set the policy for our DMARC record and lets us know what to do when the SPF record or the DKIM fail. And we'll talk about this in just a few minutes. There's 3 settings here about that for none, quarantine, or reject. That percent is the percentage of how strict to apply that chosen option. So in the above, we have that percent = 0. And so we're going to slowly ratchet that up to 100 for each of these levels, the none, quarantine, or reject. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. The RUA and the RUF are for reporting. And so this is the email address where you want your DMARC reports set. And for the RUA, that gets sent usually daily, and the RUF gets sent as things have trouble. We'll talk about that in just a second. For the domains that don't send email, we'll need to set a defensive DMARC record. You'll ultimately set the data from up above where we had the name set for DMARC, text, and time to live. That data will be V = DMARC1, P = reject, and percent of enforcement = 100. That means that any email that doesn't meet the SPF or DKIM records that you set before for those defensive records, since none of those will ever be met, then all of the emails should be rejected. This means that no one could ever send an email from that domain. And so that means that as a result, no hackers or scammers could ever misuse those domains. This is an important part, and a lot of people forget about those other domains that they own, or maybe they're just sitting on for a later future project. It's important to set these defensive records now to make sure that those domains are protected. And if you do ever start to use them, make sure to go in and update them accordingly with all of the stuff that we've talked about so far. No matter how you set your DMARC, again, you need to validate your changes. This is the most important part in all of this. And so there's a lot of free checks. Again, DMARC has a DMARC inspector, and you can go and type in your domain and inspect that domain. So how do we put it all together? What does this strategy look like? Well, before we begin, unlike setting the SPF and DKIM records, configuring your DMARC record is more of an art than a science. And if you set your DMARC record too strict too early, you can have the risk of having your emails not reach your recipient's email inbox or potentially go to their spam folder. So we recommend a 8-step approach. And so we've tried to break this down to make it a little bit more of a step and tiered system, which should help you walk through this. Generally, this can go pretty quick if possible. And depending on how large your environment is or how large your company is, you may be able to implement this sooner or may take a little bit longer. But if you have a smaller company, you may be able to do this quicker. We recommend in the early steps here, take a time of about 3 to 5 weeks for each of the few steps. Gather all of the information. That way, if maybe emails only get sent monthly from a certain service, you'll be able to catch all of that information. And then later on, as you've started to update your list and document everything appropriately, you can move at quicker intervals, like 1 week in between. So phase one, if you've set your SPF records and you've set your DKIM records, the first step for your DMARC record is to set the P equals none and the percent to 100. And so this allows your DMARC policy to be created and for you, more importantly, to start receiving your DMARC records. And that can go to an email address of your choosing. And you'll see up above there, we have your name at yourorganization.com. You'll put in your email address. Those reports are going to get sent to you daily, and they're going to come from every single mail server who received an email from your company. So as a result, you may receive a large number of those DMARC reports. So you may get one from Google, you may get one from Yahoo, you may get one from Microsoft, depending on how many people in your company are interacting with other domains. In addition, these reports come in a format called XML. So you may have to use an online tool to help you make sense of all of the information. There are a number of DMARC report readers available online that you can just drag and drop those XMLs into and see the information a little bit more clearly. That'll let you know how many emails arrived from your domain, maybe what times they arrived, the quantity, all that information. That report then will show you that email was sent directly, if those emails were sent directly from your domain, or maybe on your domain's behalf. This is important because it'll show you which emails did not meet the SPF or DKIM criteria. So you might remember that list that we had as part of our mise en place setup. You can make sure that everything that was part of that list is actually validated through your DMARC reports. So, for example, maybe somebody in your organization starts to use MailChimp and you didn't have that on your list originally. You'll start to see MailChimp appearing on those DMARC reports, and you can go and figure out maybe who's using MailChimp and make sure that information gets added to your SPF or DKIM reports. If no one at your company is using MailChimp, that would be cause for concern from a security standpoint, and you want to track down and understand how that was happening and who is misusing it. Phase two, we start to change things up. We move that P to equals quarantine and the percent up to 5. And so once you think you've tracked down everything, we start to enforce it. When you move to that quarantine state, you're telling those receiving email servers who ultimately receive emails from your company to send a email that doesn't match up with SPF or DKM to the spam folder. So that means that anyone who's impersonating your company, some of those emails will start to land in spam for sure, if they weren't already. Of course, you can see that percent equals 5, and we have a little bit more to go. But before we do that, now that you've started to receive those DMARC reports, you should have a pretty comprehensive list of everywhere that can send as your domain. And so you may remember that originally we set our SPF record at a soft fail, that tilde all. Well, now it's time to start ratcheting things down. And since we have the full list of everywhere that's allowed to send emails on behalf of your company, we're going to want to ratchet that up to that hard fail or that dash all. You'll want to monitor the results of this change in your DMARC reports and make sure that everything is progressing as you intended. Up next, you're going to start to ratchet up that percentage to 50%. And this time, you're also going to add a new part to the record for your DMARC, which is the RUF or RUF. That RUA report usually comes daily. And remember, it will come from all of the domains that have received email on behalf of your organization. And so you may receive quite a number of them. But usually they show up at about 2 or 3 in the morning each day. The RUF, on the other hand, will happen when an email does get rejected immediately. And so it'll shoot you an email and say, hey, we've had a problem with some of your either SPF or DKIM enforced emails. And so you'll get some more information about maybe something that was blocked in closer to real time rather than the RUA emails. This is important so you can tell a customer potentially to go check their spam folder or contact the person whose email was blocked so they can address it sooner rather than maybe you finding out about it the next day through the RUA reports. Up next, you're going to move that percentage to 100. And so you're now at full quarantine. So that means that any email that doesn't meet the SPF or DKIM records will be guaranteed to be sent to a organization's spam folder. So as a result, you've now stopped hackers from impersonating your email address. Finally, we move into the reject phase of things. And this means that you're starting to reject emails. So this means that rather than email being moved to a user spam folder, you're now saying to the receiving email server, don't receive this email. In fact, don't ever let it even get delivered. This is kind of a ratchet up, right? It means that no longer is anything going to spam. It means that it just flat out won't get delivered. You want to make sure that your list is accurate before you move to this phase. But ultimately, this is a key piece of the DMARC strategy is to make sure that anybody impersonating your organization can't send emails. A better way of looking at this, the P equals reject phase is like enforcing an allow list. You're saying that only the following places are allowed to send email on behalf of our organization. It's definitely a little bit of work to get to this point, but through all of those DMARC reports that you've been receiving, you should have a great and very concise list and an accurate list around all those SPF and DKIM records to make sure that your DMARC record is being enforced accurately. On to the final or phase 7 here, where you're moving that percent up to 50. So you're blocking more emails that do not meet that SPF or DKIM record criteria. And you'll want to continue to monitor the results in your DMARC reports. Finally, the last step, that P equals reject and the percent equals 100, you've made it. And you're now blocking any email that doesn't meet your SPF or DKIM records. This is a huge step for you and your organization because it means that now you're making sure that all of your emails are delivered accordingly. So all of your marketing emails are validated through either SPF and DKIM. And then that DMARC record lets the receiving email server know that you're enforcing it and that you have set the rules. That gives that extra trust to your emails and makes sure that your marketing emails make it through, but it also stops scammers and hackers from impersonating you. So is that it? For now, yes. But coming soon is BIMI, which is Brand Indicators for Message Identification. This is something that's coming down the line where it's actually going to help you set a trusted image for your email senders. So as a result, your organization's logo will appear anytime an email is sent either from or on behalf of your organization. This is a great step because it means that for major companies, any email that comes from your organization will now have maybe your company's logo appear next to it. The only way, though, that you're going to be able to implement the BIMI when it officially gets released across a broader set of email providers is you have to have DMARC fully set up, and you have to either be in the quarantine phase or the reject phase. So that means that you have to have your SPF, your DKIM, and then at least be into about step 3 or 4 of that strategy that we talked about for your DMARC records. So what's up next? Start at the top. Document every source that can send an email as your company. Understand how they are being used and use this opportunity to consolidate some of your providers. Work down that list. Find all of the relevant information for SPF and DKIM records. Start to implement that strategy that we covered. And find a trusted cybersecurity advisor. We covered a strategy that will work for most companies, but not all. And so if you're overwhelmed or maybe your company has an edge case, find someone who can help. Don't go this alone and don't potentially make it so that you can't deliver any emails from your company. So if you want to take action, a couple things here. All of this work could be done in as little as a few weeks. For smaller companies, you may be able to move quicker through those steps that we outlined for the DMARC records, or you may have less places that send email, and so you can gather that list quickly. For larger organizations, it will likely take a little bit more time. You get 2-for-1 benefits. You get to save your company's reputation from hacker misuse, and you get to increase your email marketability and deliverability. That's a win for you, for your IT team, and for your overall marketing team. And finally, it creates that trust in your email domain and your company, especially in the future for BIMI. Of course, if you're having trouble with any of this, Hive Systems is here to help. We provide smarter cybersecurity solutions with our trusted experts and have direct experience across the public and the private sectors with deep industry knowledge made approachable with a focus on your return on investment. In the meantime, though, we suggest you subscribe to our Approachable Cyber Threats, or ACT. They help you stay on top of the latest news, and you can subscribe at www.hivesystems.io/subscribe. In addition, in the link to today's presentation, you'll find 3 articles from our Approachable Cyber Threats, where we walk through all of the steps for each of these parts for configuring SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records. There's a great chance in the half hour that we've moved through this presentation, you may need to watch it 2 or 3 times to get all the information. But these Approachable Cyber Threats posts, the ACT posts, are a great follow-along document from that side and can help you properly configure those SPF, DKIM, and DMARC records. Finally, we're into the 3rd month here of 2021, and we are still offering our Cybersecurity Accelerator Kit, which you can find at www.hivesystems.io/guides. Make sure to go download that. It has some great documents like our New Year's cybersecurity checklist, a great way to clean house and make sure that everything is up to date, along with some of our great phishing awareness posters and 3 variety packs with our Business Booster, Allied Advertising, and 90s Nostalgia pack. Finally, looks like we had one question today from our presentation I saw, and the question was, who is supposed to implement this? It is not a quick fix. Depending on how large your organization is, there might be a couple teams involved. If you have a smaller IT team, someone on your IT team might be able to make this happen and get into those DNS records. But as we talked about, it's a bit of a partnership. You have to find out every part of the organization that might be able to send emails. So, whether that includes the marketing teams, the IT teams, or somebody in between, tracking down all of those things is a little bit of an exercise. And so it ends up being a team effort to get it across the finish line. For bigger organizations, it may be even more. There may be a lot of parts and a lot of information that's coming in to make all of this happen. So make sure to step through it and partner with other departments across your organization to make sure that it's implemented correctly and securely. At the end of the day, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC are the future in terms of making sure that email is secure and authentic. Make sure that you have it in place to stop scammers and hackers, and make sure that all of your marketing emails are getting delivered. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We look forward to talking to you next month at our next Hive Live session, where we'll be talking about our future as far as insider threat is concerned and how to prevent it from a threat intel standpoint. We look forward to talking to you then.